Hello again, welcome to a new video. Today I want to talk about plot versus character, the distinctions between them, and how they're actually, not mutually exclusive, how they're different. This might sound obvious, but I think there's a few subtleties that are quite interesting. I might sound like I'm repeating myself a little bit at times too, but there's a few things that I've thought about a little more deeply recently that I thought I'd want to share with you. So there's this distinction in a lot of literary circles between character-driven narrative and plot-driven narrative. Often genre fiction is considered plot-driven, whereas literary fiction, that is quote-unquote literary fiction, is considered more character-driven. I mean, you think about it, a book like Anna Karenina is this sprawling narrative that is really focused on the character's internal life. I mean, things happen in the book, but it's very, very character-driven. Tolstoy spends a lot of time building up these characters, and scenes are often just the characters having conversations or thinking about things. And that's a literary fantasy, and then you think about a literary novel, and then you think about something like, Harry Potter or something. Let's just go with a simple example. Where so much happens in those books. But this distinction has become quite simplified to the point that in reviews of fantasy novels or sci-fi novels, you'll find them commended for mixing plot and character. I mean, I know for a fact that there's a review of The Passage by Justin Cronin, which does exactly this. It calls it a literary super thriller driven at once by character and plot. So it's become almost as if these two things are mutually exclusive and can't mix. But really, I would argue that everything comes from character, including plot. If you don't have good characters, then having a great plot is not going to matter. And this, I think, is a problem that I've had trying to get into The Walking Dead, for example. I find that the characters aren't distinct enough. Some of them are quite unlikable without having enough sort of layers and complexity to make me like them, and so on and so forth. This is just, of course, just my opinion. If you don't agree, if you like The Walking Dead, then please explain why, because I've wanted to get into it for a long time. So leave me a note in the comments there. But for me, that was a problem with that series. As opposed to something like Game of Thrones, the books, which had both. Had great character. All the characters were very distinct, very complex, and a lot of stuff happened. I'm not a huge fan of the TV show, but the books I do quite like. For those reasons. So, I mean, really, they're not mutually exclusive. If you want to tell a great story, you have to have great characters. And, I mean, it's not for nothing that a lot of books on writing, a lot of teachers of writing, really start with character and then go from there. In his book, The Anatomy of Story, John Truby, who again I've talked about a couple of times on this channel, starts with a chapter on how to write a premise, because he says everything springs from the premise. But then immediately he goes to character, and everything after that comes from the work that you do on character. And in his Brigham Young University lecture series, the author Brandon Sanderson, who I urge you to check out, particularly that lecture series, is really, really great. He's a great teacher. But Brandon Sanderson, in those lectures, talks about how you can have a so-so story world and great characters, and that will be far more readable than a story where you've put a lot of work into your story world and you have so-so characters. And this is not to say that the characters have to have an arc. In those lectures, again, there's a lengthy discussion of the Superman versus the Everyman, and stories where there's Superman, like stories like James Bond, stories like, well, Superman, obviously, and detective stories, and a lot of those things. Sherlock Holmes is another one. Interesting because it's great seeing someone so hyper competent in their particular field just succeeding. It's sort of almost wish fulfillment, living vicariously through the character. But it's still the character that we gravitate towards, and how they deal with things. So, I mean, I want to talk about a little bit about that, a little bit about how everything should come from your character. And I'm going to rely heavily on these two authors as well as a few other things to talk about that. This is kind of a lengthy preamble. Apologies for that. But, so, when you're thinking about character, people often go, oh, characters are complicated. And they are. People are complicated, and if you want to make characters that feel real, you're going to have to make them complicated because that's how people are. But what we need to realize is that the that the reader is going to be able to fill in a lot of blanks themselves. They do this with plot, they do this with character motivation. So, if we give them a few things to latch onto, they're going to fill out the character. And this is something that Truby talks about indirectly in his book. For example, he talks about really only 3 things to do with character that you need to know when you're writing characters, and that is their weakness, their need, and their desire. And I mean, there's some complexities to this, like psychological versus moral need, with psychological need being something that the character needs to do to fix something in their own life, to change the way that they think, and moral need is, or the moral weakness, rather, which is then tied to the moral need. The moral weakness is, something that they're doing that is hurting other people, not themselves. And then the needs tied to those are, basically to stop doing that in some way. And the desire, these needs are not necessarily conscious. The desire is conscious. The desire is a goal that the character works towards throughout the story, that drives the story, and this may be at odds with the need. For example, your character may want to rule the world or gain power, but their need is to learn to respect other people, for example, or not step on other people to get what you want, to get what they want. And of course these two are at odds. But in trying to get the desire, the character will come to realise their need, hopefully, they may not. and will then achieve that need at the end, or they won't and they will be destroyed. This is Truby's idea. So, I mean, the need comes from the weakness. In that example, the weakness would be a selfishness, arrogance, thirst for power, that sort of thing. Which in turn hurts other people. Pride, maybe, would be in there. And with these three things, I mean, you can extrapolate from these three things to create a really complex character. But it's these three things, as long as you know these three things, Truby argues that you will have a great character. And he also argues for defining them against other characters, because characters don't stand alone. People don't stand alone. We're communal animals. So having the character come up against other people that push him to face his weakness, that in some ways have their own manifestations of that weakness, and that are able to attack it in different ways, and that in some ways are all opposed to each other as well, not just to the main character, creates this sort of web. He calls it a character web. Very interesting. Creates a web of characters that brings more complexity to your story. And it's through the characters' actions in the way that they go about their desire and the way that they discover their need that gives both the emotional interest of the story and actually moves the story along. And so this is, what we need to know. But I think it's worth noting that something that Ursula Le Guin said, which I'll just read from her book, Steering the Craft, where she says this: I define story as a narrative of events, external or psychological, that moves through time or implies the passage of time and that involves change. I define plot as a form of story that uses action as its mode, usually in the form of conflict, and that closely and intricately connects one act to another, usually through a causal chain ending in a climax. So, and then she goes on to say this: climax is one kind of pleasure, plot is one kind of story. But most serious modern fictions can't be reduced to a plot or retold without fatal loss, except in their own words. The story is not in the plot, but in the telling. It is the telling that moves. And there's a bit longer there, but... And then she says, conflict is one kind of behaviour. There are others, such as relating, finding, losing, bearing, etc. Change is the universal aspect of all these sources of story. So as I've said, a character doesn't need to change, but often the most powerful stories will involve change, or they will change the reader or the audience. Because there's a form there's a story form, black comedy, which you see in films like Goodfellas, and some would argue maybe Yorgos Lanthimos' The Lobster and lots of other examples, where the character doesn't learn, but it's so obvious what the lesson is that he should have learned that the audience has that moral revelation, and somehow they're changed. So the audience goes through a character change then. But in any case, there's change within the story. And I think Le Guin makes... The point that I really want to focus on with Le Guin, though, was that conflict is not necessarily needed to move the plot forward. It's more so just human interaction can be something that moves the plot forward, and we see this again in Anna Karenina, certain novels of manners, such as Jane Austen's novels. Which is not to say that there isn't conflict in these novels, it's just conflict of a lower simmering sort, and there are other human things going on at play, such as Le Guin says, relating, and so on. So really, I mean, story is about how humans interact and relate to each other. And this can be held together by plot, through character conflict, and so on, and through lots of events happening. But it's always comes down to character. And this applies to your story world being a manifestation of your character, which I don't really have time to go into right now. I can do a video on that if you'd like, at a later date, though. So again, request that in the comments if you'd like. Or your moral argument also comes through the way that the character acts. Symbols reflect the character's inner world, and so on. Everything comes down to character, regardless of if it's more plot-driven, more conflict-driven, or something a bit more sprawling and relational. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing I wanted to debunk. Start with character, or if you've got a great idea for a more plot-driven story, make sure that your characters are strong, because otherwise, no matter how good your plot is, it's not going to hold the attention of people if there aren't great characters to push it along. Sorry if this week was a bit rambly. It was just something I wanted to kind of get off my chest, talk about for a bit. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something from it. As usual, please subscribe to my channel for notifications of new content. I post every Monday. Like and share this video with people you think would enjoy it. Comment below. Let's get a discussion going. You know, tell me why you like The Walking Dead, why you don't like Game of Thrones. You know, if you disagree with me about plot and character, let's talk about that. Anything you want me to talk about in future videos, put that down there. I'll try and reply to all those comments, because I think let's discuss it. It's great to get some discussion going on writing. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook. The links will be down there. You can join my writers group on Facebook, the Writers Network, and visit my website. All the links will be down there as well. And check out Brandon Sanderson and John Truby and Ursula Le Guin, because they're all really good at their respective fields. So, once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week. Thanks.